G'day, and welcome to another episode of Toxic Revisited. And yeah, this time we will be revisiting Toxic and Richard's broader writing. And then we'll be exploring the strange reality that Richard Flanagan seems to live in the current that flows beneath the real world. But first, let's have a flashback to Toxic Part 4, entitled, very aptly for this episode, Reality Isn't Good Enough for Flanagan.
Flashback.
I think this goes to the whole modus operandi of Richard's writing. Reality for Richard, no matter how horrifying or confronting, is not enough for him. Only fiction, a constructed world of his own, can take reality to a place where Richard is central, where he controls it, literally controls the narrative. Let's look at his body of work. Wanting, an imagination of Governor Sir John Franklin's infatuation with Aboriginal girl Mathina. First Person, an imagination of Richard's own writing of the autobiography of John Friedrich. The Narrow Road to the Deep North, his father's story. And while I don't have a cover of it, because it's very hard to get, that biography of John Friedrich, the first book that Richard had to his name, and paradoxically, the only other factual book that he attempted to write, but was forced by circumstances to fictionalise. All his works are not based on a true story types of tales. They're far more than that. They're fictionalised fantasies of something that has a tenuous link to reality.
End of flashback.
So, while I've alleged and proven that huge parts of Toxic have been exaggerated, taken out of context, and even fabricated, the question still remains. Does he even realise that he's doing that? Or does he live in a world where reality is not enough? But a recent announcement brings it all into perspective. So you remember 10 years ago when Flanagan won the Booker Prize for his novel The Narrow Road to the Deep North, a fictionalised account of his father's already real-life horrific experiences in World War II? Well, 10 years later, he's gone and won another award. So just this week, Flanagan has won the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction for his latest work, Question 7. Now, one of the first to congratulate him was Bob Brown, who in his media release said, "His latest book, Question 7, is a masterpiece in the annals of timeless literature." Now, Bob's not an expert on literature, and whilst the term can be used for a collection of work such as scientific literature, the term literature, in terms of a single piece of work, is more commonly understood to mean refers to pieces of writing specifically considered to be an art form, especially novels, plays and poems. So, not non-fiction then, unless Bob Brown is actually alleging that Richard's pieces of non-fiction, such as Toxic, are actually fiction. But then it gets a little bit even more blurred, because in an article in the Mercury about the prize, you know, the Mercury, that well-known scientific journal that Richard quotes from so often in Toxic, well, it says, in Question 7, Flanagan combines memoir, history and fiction to try and better understand his late parents. Fiction? In a non-fiction book? Or maybe the reporter has read Toxic and thinks that Richard's doing it again. But maybe not, because later in the article it says, while Question 7 is a work of non-fiction, the author says he wrote the book in the spirit of a novel. But if you think that was bad enough, that he was deliberately passing off another piece of fictionalised reality as non-fiction, the plot, surprisingly, thickens even further. And to use one of Flanagan's favourite sayings, turns into a toxic soup of not just deception, but an alternative universe. shortly before the announcement of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Literature, Flanagan was interviewed on the Baillie Gifford Read Smart podcast about his work, Question 7. Early in the interview, he was asked about fiction versus non-fiction.
Now, you're somebody who's been recognised so widely in the world of literary fiction. How does it feel being shortlisted now for a non-fiction prize?
Well, I never really quite know why writers want to be understood. I think it's misunderstandings that make us, Georgina, so I'm delighted to be shortlisted for a non-fiction prize.
I think that it's misunderstandings that make us. Is he actually having a bit of a sly dig here at the Baillie Gifford Prize Committee in that they assumed that his work was non-fiction, when in fact it may not have been? Who knows? Or is it in fact code for him saying that he fictionalises non-fiction in pretty much everything that he writes? Because a little bit later in the interview he says,
Suddenly species were disappearing all around me. Just yards from where I live is a bush park, where the last swift parrots can be found. There's less than 500 of these, the fastest parrot in the world, a beautiful little bird.
It's just a question that yards from where he lives is the last population of swift parrots? Notwithstanding that swift parrots can be found across the east coast of Tasmania, from Swansea in the north to my home of Dover in the far south, and particularly seem to be found in every logging coupe that the Bob Brown Foundation chooses to stage a protest in. Now, Richard lives in Glebe, an inner city suburb of Hobart, and the nearest park, the Queen's Domain, is 450 yards away. And while the Hobart City Council is doing some habitat restoration work, it seems that the habitat has some way to go. It takes approximately 100 years for a tree to begin forming hollows so that these saplings will one day create critical habitats for swift parrots. Another piece of alternative reality from Flanagan. But then he's asked about a near-death experience that he encountered almost drowning on the Franklin River earlier in his life, and which he recounts in Question 7.
You had a near-death experience on the Franklin River. It's a pivotal moment in the book. How did it impact on your perspective on life and writing?
Well, immeasurably. And being immeasurable, I can't enumerate it or recount it here. All I could do finally was to revisit the experience and write about it in the way I did in this book. And I think what was interesting in writing this book is that it made me think a lot about the fallibility of memory.
The fallibility of memory, eh? Well, I'm only 2 years younger than Richard Flanagan, and I can recall reading, back in 1994, a novel called Death of a River Guide, in which a young man is drowning in the Franklin River. Can't quite remember the name of the author of that one, though. Oh yeah, I remember. It was Richard Flanagan. I'm a bit annoyed I had to use that graphic because I own that novel and it was an amazing piece of work. It really, really encapsulated what it means to be a Tasmanian. But then it was a fictionalised imagining of Flanagan's actual experience, such that, in the interview at least, he couldn't remember writing. So what are the boundaries for Flanagan between fact and fiction?
Although memory can be unreliable, but the whole book, you're exploring the boundaries there between truth and fiction. How do you navigate that, the unreliability of memory and the language in your storytelling?
I'm very clear when I'm dealing with something factual as to what is fact and what is imagined.
So he's very clear as to what the differences are between fact and fiction? I'm not so sure. And not so sure that Flanagan even understands what reality is.
It is these currents beneath the so-called real world that are actually our true reality.
Excuse my French. So if Flanagan's true reality is separate from the real world, where does that leave the rest of us who live in the real world? If this is what non-fiction is defined as where any imagination, any opinion is now truth, then where are we? Because that means that any fact is now fiction, depending on where you stand. Real news is fake news. Baillie Gifford might perceive question 7 as non-fiction, but when the author himself is not so sure, then where does that leave us? And when Flanagan admits that his reality is separate from the so-called real world, then can we take anything that he says or writes at face value? I really don't know. So that's probably going to be the last Toxic Revisited I do. Stay tuned for a new series coming up, which I won't let you in on yet, but I'm sure you'll be interested. And yeah, if you've liked this one, please click like, please subscribe, hit me up in the comments below, and yeah, we'll see you somewhere next time, but maybe not on a beach this time. Maybe on a jetty. Thanks for watching. So I shot that video yesterday, and when I got home I turned on the ABC TV news to see a breaking story about a life and death experience on the Franklin River in the wilderness of Tasmania. The man had been with a group of travellers paddling down the Franklin River when they stopped to camp for the evening, and he went scouting around the area, unfortunately slipping and getting his leg trapped between some rocks on the edge of the river. He was trapped for 20 hours, and by the time the rescue helicopter got to him, they were unable to extract him from the situation, and they all had to make the awful decision to amputate his leg above the knee. The man is now in critical condition in the Royal Hobart Hospital, and we wish him all the best. And after I viewed the story, I must admit it actually really shocked me, particularly of the things I'd been talking about earlier in the day. And I had myself a little bit of a reality check. Because in the real world, the reality is real. And that experience surpasses anything that could have been fictionalised. And I guess that's where we'll leave it again. Safe in knowing that the real world is where we all live. In 2015, my mum passed away, and her request in her will was that her ashes be scattered on this little beach on the Huon River in the far south of Tasmania. And it was a pretty windy day, and whilst we scattered the ashes, I'm not so sure that I might have breathed in a bit of them. So in Flanagan's alternative reality, maybe I am still carrying a piece of my mother close to my heart. Well, in my lungs at least.